man stumbles upon a pack of cookies, expired for over 10 years, but without hesitation, he shoves them into his mouth and starts savoring them. Meanwhile, his elderly father finds some shredded cigarettes tucked in a car seat and, just as thrilled, pockets them like they're treasures. As the father and son prepare to leave, a pack of mutated wild dogs suddenly charges toward them. They quickly dive into a nearby abandoned car, holding their breath as the sound of heavy footsteps grows closer. Ever since a catastrophic disaster 10 years ago polluted the planet's water supply, Earth's population has plummeted to less than 1%. With resources dangerously scarce, humans are no longer the apex predators they once were. Instead, they live day by day, hiding in forests and hunting just to survive. After what feels like an eternity, the wild dogs finally move on, allowing the pair to cautiously crawl out of the vehicle. They head toward a makeshift wooden door camouflaged with branches, leading to a small, shabby cabin that they've called home for years. The man's girlfriend lies bedridden after being bitten by a wild animal, her condition worsening by the day. The father and son's scavenging trip yielded nothing, leaving the family with no choice but to sip on distilled water to stave off their hunger. Jake takes out the last of their antibiotics and carefully feeds them to his girlfriend, hoping it will at least keep her worsening injury at bay. Meanwhile, his father gathers the shredded tobacco, rolls it into a makeshift cigarette, and steps outside for a solitary smoke. Life in this post-apocalyptic world has drained every ounce of his strength. As he inhales deeply, he wonders if surviving the disaster was truly a blessing or a curse. The next morning, Jake heads outside to the makeshift outhouse. While squatting, he suddenly hears something behind him. Turning around, he's horrified to see a group of armed survivors approaching. Realizing the danger, Jake sprints back to the cabin as fast as he can. It's clear that the strangers have already spotted their home. Jake's father curses under his breath, quickly grabbing their most valuable belongings. With no time to waste, he helps Jake and his injured girlfriend escape through the back door. But the girls' injuries slow them down, and in their frantic flight, they lose their backpack without even noticing. Seeing how hopeless their situation is, the father makes a gut-wrenching decision. He pushes Jake and his girlfriend into the outhouse, covering the pit with a wooden plank to hide them. Then, clutching nothing more than a wooden stick, he charges straight at the approaching group. From the cracks of the plank, the Jake couple watch in silent horror as their father is brutally killed before their eyes. What's even more devastating for Jake and his sister is that the group doesn't leave after looting their home. Instead, they find Jake's abandoned backpack and the leader, a cold and calculating man, starts searching the area more thoroughly. Slowly, he approaches the outhouse. As he reaches for the wooden cover, Jake grabs it with all his strength, holding it down desperately. The leader pauses, leaning in closer to sniff the air. Not detecting the scent of food or anything valuable, he curses under his breath and eventually walks away with the rest of the group. Jake and his sister narrowly escape, but there's no relief in their hearts. Their home, the sanctuary they had painstakingly maintained for years, has been ransacked. Even their father's body has been taken by the raiders. This is the cruel reality of the post-apocalyptic world. Instead of banding together to survive, the remnants of humanity have turned on each other, consumed by the endless fight for scarce resources. Laws, morals, and basic decency have long been abandoned. The losers of these encounters don't just lose their possessions. Even their bodies often become someone else's meal. Jake is left utterly hopeless. Losing their supplies is one thing, but the raiders also stole the last of the antibiotics his girlfriend desperately needed. She's now facing an almost certain death. Jake considers ending his girlfriend's suffering by ending her life, but as he holds the pillow in his hands, he hesitates. After a long moment of indecision, he just can't bring himself to do it. The thought of losing two of the most important people in his life in a single day is more than he can bear. He gives his girlfriend half a bottle of water and makes a simple attempt to fix up their small cabin. Then, with a determined look on his face, Jake walks out the door. He's going to find the antibiotics she desperately needs, no matter the cost. The cold mountain road stretches out before him, and Jake shivers from the biting wind. His body is weak from hunger, and he collapses onto the ground, barely holding himself together. In his daze, he sees a young boy standing in the distance. Jake knows this is a rare chance, so with all the strength he has left, he forces himself to his feet and follows the boy. The chase leads him to an abandoned house. He kicks down the rotting door, and inside, he finds an elderly man lying on the bed. Jake's heart softens, and instead of taking anything from the house, He simply takes the clothes off the old man's body to keep himself warm. The rest of the room's belongings are left untouched. Despite the cruelty and harshness of the world around him, Jake clings to the last shred of humanity within him. Shielded from the biting cold by his newfound clothing, Jake presses on, weaving through the dense forest. Following a trail of bloodstains across the grass, he soon stumbles upon a burned-out fire pit. Among the ashes, he sees bones picked clean. The realization of what he's looking at sends a wave of sorrow through him. Fighting back his grief, Jake buries what remains of his father in a shallow grave. With no time to mourn, he sets his focus back on the task at hand, tracking down the bandits who stole the antibiotics. And soon, from the treetops, he spots smoke rising in the distance. That must be where the thieves are hiding. His excitement gets the better of him, and in his haste, Jake loses his balance and falls from the tree, disoriented and in pain. He suddenly hears the distant howls of mutated wild dogs. His injured leg slows him down, and running is no longer an option. Desperate, he finds an old pile of wood and quickly reignites the nearby fire pit. As night falls, the wild dogs circle closer. Thankfully, their primal fear of flames remains intact, and Jake miraculously survives yet another harrowing encounter. Early the next morning, Jake wakes up beside the charred remains of the fire pit. He resumes his journey, following the direction of the smoke he saw the day before. As he arrives at a small creek, he spots a woman washing bloodstains from her clothes. There's no doubt, she's one of the bandits. Jake suppresses the surge of adrenaline and quietly tails her to a nearby campsite. From a distance, he sees her tending a fire, preparing a meal. The men, however, are nowhere in sight. It's the perfect moment to retrieve the stolen antibiotics. His excitement almost gets the better of him again, as he nearly trips a makeshift alarm rigged around the camp. Steeling himself, Jake carefully bypasses the trap and sneaks into one of the tents. Inside, he frantically rummages through drawers, searching for the medicine. Just then, he catches a glimpse in a mirror. Someone is sneaking up behind him. Spinning around, he finds the woman lunging at him, her movements quick and deadly. Jake hesitates for only a second before grabbing a rock and striking her, knocking her to the ground. He doesn't waste another moment and continues his desperate search for the antibiotics. Just then, the main group of bandits returned from their hut. Jake quickly wiped away the bloodstains and dragged the woman's body out of the tent. Hiding behind a nearby tree, he watched from a distance as the bandits brought in a familiar face, the little boy he had seen earlier. The group's leader, ever cautious, sensed something was off the moment he entered the camp. Reaching into his pocket, he handed a few antibiotics to an injured comrade before arming himself with a wooden club and starting a thorough search of the area. Jake's heart raced as he curled up tightly in a tree hollow, barely managing to stay out of sight. But his relief was short-lived. Moments later, one of the bandits stumbled upon a discarded axe that belonged to the woman. It didn't take long for them to realize someone had infiltrated their camp. The entire group erupted into action, spreading out to hunt for the intruder. Jake felt a flicker of hope as he saw the commotion draw everyone away from their original positions. Acting quickly, he covered the woman's body with leaves and began crawling on the forest floor, inching closer to the tent. With most of the camp cleared out, only an injured man remained behind. This was Jake's chance to act. He crawled over to the little boy tied up nearby, pulling out a small knife to cut the ropes binding his hands. But the boy, too frightened to stay silent, made enough noise to draw the injured man's attention. As the man limped toward the source of the sound, Jake seized the moment to search the camp for the antibiotics. His search quickly led him to a locked wooden box. Just as he was preparing to pry it open, he heard voices. The rest of the group was returning. Jake had no choice but to slide under a nearby RV. From his hiding spot, Jake's heart pounded as he watched the group move around. The leader, sharp-eyed as ever, noticed the lock on the wooden box had been tampered with. Jake held his breath, panic clawing at him. But just then, the group's attention was diverted to something else. The woman's corpse, which they had discovered beneath the leaves. Jake remained frozen under the RV until nightfall, not daring to move. What he witnessed next surprised him. These people did not eat every person they killed. Instead, they held a small funeral rite for the dead woman, murmuring a few words in her memory before setting her body ablaze in a solemn fire. The next morning, as the bandits were still asleep, Jake quietly snuck into the RV. His heart pounded as he carefully searched for the key to the locked box, and finally, he found it hanging around the leader's neck. Every movement was tense, his hands slick with sweat, but Jake managed to open the box and, Just as he had hoped, the antibiotics he had lost were inside. With barely contained excitement, he quickly locked the box again, hanging the key back on the RV door. He then turned and fled the camp without a second glance. However, in his haste, he forgot about the pressure-sensitive alarm beneath his feet. The bell rang out, shattering the quiet, and the bandits immediately sprang into action. They kicked open the door and, with angry shouts, began chasing after him. Jake knew he was in serious trouble. He dashed through the woods, sticking to paths he knew well, narrow, treacherous routes that most people avoided. His pursuers, more cautious, stopped to ready their bows and arrows, but they couldn't keep up with his speed. Not daring to return to his small cabin, Jake instead headed for an abandoned house he had passed earlier. As he entered, he noticed the telltale paw prints of wild dogs scattered across the floor. A sense of dread filled him as he stepped further inside. There, on the floor, lay the bones of the old man he had seen earlier, devoured by the dogs. Jake's heart sank. Was this the inevitable fate of humanity? His will to fight evaporated, and he just kept standing there, waiting for the bandits to catch up with him. When Jake came to, he found himself completely at the mercy of his captors. The campfire was already crackling nearby, and several bandits were sharpening their knives, preparing for the grand task ahead. Jake's heart sank, knowing he was next. But then, his eyes landed on a dog whistle lying on the ground. Without hesitation, Jake lunged forward, grabbed it with his teeth, and blew as hard as he could. If he was going to die, he'd make sure these ruthless bandits didn't get away with it. Within moments, the forest erupted with the sound of wild dogs barking. Panic spread like wildfire among the bandits. They abandoned their tools and fled into the woods without looking back. Jake wasted no time. He struggled to free himself from the ropes, managing to curl up behind a tree just in time. Miraculously, the wild dogs ignored him, turning their attention to the fleeing bandits instead. The chaos unfolded as the dogs chased the bandits down one by one. In their desperation, some of the men even shoved their own companions to the ground in an attempt to escape. When the dust settled, the leader of the group realized only 2 of his men were left. Enraged, he vowed to hunt Jake down and tear him apart. Jake, sensing the impending threat, prepared to fight back. He used his jacket as a decoy, luring one of the bandits away before stealthily taking him out from behind. Then, disguising himself in the fallen bandit's clothing, Jake managed to blend in long enough to get close to another. Once within reach, he swiftly took the second man down. With the leader now the only one left standing, Jake saw no reason to hide anymore. Without hesitation, he fired an arrow, piercing the leader's leg. Just as Jake prepared to strike the finishing blow, his bowstring snapped. The 2 men were forced into a desperate melee combat. But before either could land a decisive blow, the wild dogs returned. Jake, quick on his feet, immediately turned to run, but the leader was not so lucky. Within moments, the wild dogs overtook him, tearing him apart. Meanwhile, back at the house, Jake's girlfriend was woken by the noise outside. Struggling to her feet, she looked out to see a large pack of wild dogs charging towards her. She did her best to brace the door with her body, but the sounds of dogs digging around the cabin soon filled the air. Time passed in a blur, and finally, Jake returned, carrying the much-needed antibiotics. When he saw the door wide open, his heart sank. Was she gone? Had she not made it until he could return? He collapsed in despair. Just when he thought all hope was lost, his girlfriend's frail figure suddenly appeared behind